The maintenance tunnels beneath Cairo's Sadat Metro station weren't supposed to hum. Karim had worked these tunnels for 15 years, and they definitely weren't supposed to hum like this, a deep, steady vibration that made his teeth ache and his phone screen glitch. He'd found the markings 3 days ago, hidden behind a section of crumbling concrete that had given way during routine repairs. At first, he thought they were just more ancient graffiti that occasionally turned up in the deeper tunnels. Cairo was built on Cairo. After all, layers upon layers of history compressed into the earth like sedimentary rock. But these weren't like the other hieroglyphs he'd seen in museums. These seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, shifting like oil on water. And they matched too perfectly with the station's emergency exit diagrams. "You need to see this," he typed into his phone, attaching a photo to the encrypted message. Professor Hassan had said to contact him if anything unusual turned up during the retrofit, no matter how small. The professor had been oddly specific about that, just as he'd been specific about installing the new electromagnetic sensors throughout the station's lower levels. The reply came almost instantly: "Don't move. Wait there. And whatever you do, don't stand on the central maintenance tile at exactly 3:47 p.m. Karim checked his watch. 3:43 p.m. He looked down at the floor tile. He was standing on, the one with the ancient symbol that looked eerily like the modern emergency exit sign, and realized with a start that it was exactly in the center of the tunnel's geometric pattern. His phone buzzed again. "The Book of the Dead wasn't about death at all, Karim. It was about doors. And you're standing on one that's about to open." 3:44 p.m. He should move. He really should move. But the humming had changed pitch, and the hieroglyphs on the walls were definitely moving now, and something deep in his maintenance worker's soul needed to know where this door led. 3:45 p.m. Karim pulled out his rusty maintenance key ring, the one that opened every door in the metro system, and wondered if some doors had been waiting for the right key all along. #House of Doors. ## Part 2. The First Gate. 3:46 p.m. Karim's maintenance keys had started to vibrate, rattling against each other like wind chimes in an electromagnetic storm. The oldest key, the brass one he'd inherited from his predecessor, worn smooth by decades of use, was practically leaping in his palm. The humming reached a fever pitch. His phone screen went black, then displayed impossible numbers. Hieroglyphic sequences that definitely weren't part of any operating system he knew. 3:47 p.m. He didn't step off the tile. The world folded. There's a peculiar kind of knowledge that comes from maintaining the same tunnels for 15 years. You learn every crack, every sound, every subtle change in air pressure that signals an approaching train. But nothing in those 15 years had prepared Karim for the sensation of reality, origami itself around him. The maintenance tunnel stretched like taffy, the walls elongating into impossible geometries. The hieroglyphs he discovered peeled themselves off the walls, swimming through the air like luminous fish, arranging themselves into a three-dimensional equation he somehow understood despite never studying advanced mathematics. And his key, that ancient brass key, was floating in front of him, pointing like a compass needle towards somewhere else. When the folding stopped, Karim found himself in what looked like a control room. But not like any control room he'd seen in the metro system. The walls were covered in the same shifting hieroglyphs, but here they were clearly labels and readouts. Modern LCD screens were mounted next to carved limestone panels, both displaying identical information in radically different forms. "Agad, you brought the key." Karim spun around. An elderly man in a pristine white galabia stood by what appeared to be a mixing board made of crystal and stone. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I am Anubis," the man said matter-of-factly, as if introducing himself as a bank manager. "The original one. The position has been somewhat automated since my time, but we still need human operators, particularly ones who understand the importance of proper maintenance." He gestured at Karim's key ring. "Those aren't just for the metro doors, you know. They're copies, somewhat degraded ones, of the original keys of opening. We've been waiting rather a long time for someone to bring them back to the station." "Station?" Karim managed to ask. "Yes, the border station. The first gate." Anubis smiled. "Where did you think all those metro lines really led?" The crystal mixing board hummed to life, displaying a map of Cairo's metro system overlaid with something far more complex, a transit map of time itself. "Now then," Anubis said, rubbing his hands together. "Shall we begin your training?" The morning shift for maintaining the time stream starts in about. He consulted a sundial that somehow displayed digital numbers. 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago is in about 5 minutes, Anubis clarified, noting Karim's bewildered expression. Time moves differently here in the border station. Think of it as the break room between realities. Karim stared at his key ring, now hovering in a perfect orbital pattern around the crystal control board. Each key glowed with a different frequency, casting tiny hieroglyphic shadows that danced across the limestone walls. "But I have a family," he said, "a shift supervisor who's probably wondering why I haven't reported back. I can't just—" "Ah, yes," Anubis interrupted, typing something into what looked like a keyboard made of scarab shells. "Miriam, your wife. Basim, your son currently failing mathematics but excelling at football. And your supervisor, Mr. Khalil, who has been trying to call you for the past." He squinted at a readout, 0 seconds in relative time. "You see, that's the wonderful thing about maintaining the time stream. You can have all the time in the world and still be home for dinner." A wall of monitors flickered to life, showing dozens of metro stations across Cairo. But they weren't just showing the present. Some displayed scenes from ancient times, others glimpses of possible futures. In one screen, Karim saw himself eating breakfast that morning. In another, he watched himself reading this very moment. "The thing about time," Anubis continued, pulling the tools from a drawer that seemed to extend into infinity, "is that it requires constant maintenance. Just like your metro tunnels. Reality leaks. Causality breaks down. Sometimes whole centuries get jammed like turnstiles." He handed Karim what looked like a cross between a wrench and an ankh. "That's why we need people like you. People who can spot when something's not working right and know how to fix it." "And the Book of the Dead?" Karim asked, surprised at how natural the otherworldly tool felt in his hand. "Technical manual. Very detailed. Excellent troubleshooting guide." Anubis patted a massive tome that was both papyrus and digital tablet simultaneously. "Though I always said they should have called it Time Travel for Dummies instead. Much more accurate." A red light began flashing on the crystal board. Anubis frowned. "Ah, your first emergency repair. Seems we have a temporal pressure buildup in Ramesses Station, circa 1334 BCE. Some fools tried to create a paradox." He sighed. "Amateur time travelers. They never read the manual." An ancient bronze door materialized in the center of the control room, its surface crawling with living hieroglyphs. "Shall we?" Anubis gestured toward the door. "Your toolbox is your heart. Your knowledge is your guide. And if you see any pharaohs," he paused, "tell them their warranties have expired." Karim gripped the quantum-ankh-wrench tighter and stepped toward the door. After all, he thought, maintenance was maintenance, whether it was fixing a broken turnstile or mending the fabric of time itself. He just hoped he'd still make it home for his wife's Malokia. Some things, even time itself, shouldn't mess with. The bronze door opened into chaos. Ancient Egypt materialized around them in a swirl of sand and quantum particles, but something was clearly wrong. The air itself seemed to stutter, time hiccuping like a scratched record. In the distance, the half-built walls of Ramesses' great temple flickered between different stages of construction, never quite settling on a single moment. "Well," Anubis said, consulting what appeared to be a papyrus scroll that displayed real-time diagnostic data, "this is worse than I thought. Someone's created a Class 3 temporal eddy. See how the causality streams are tangled?" Karim did see it, though he couldn't explain how. It was like developing a new sense, chronological peripheral vision. He could somehow perceive the layers of time overlapping and contradicting each other, like watching multiple films projected onto the same screen. "There," he pointed to a spot near the temple's foundation. "That's where the time stream is knotted." He didn't know how he knew this, but the knowledge felt as natural as identifying a faulty circuit breaker. Anubis beamed. "Excellent. The keys are already teaching you. They contain millennia of maintenance knowledge, passed down through generations of timekeepers. Though most just thought they were ordinary metro workers." He paused. "Well, you're half right about the location. But in temporal maintenance, we have to think in 4 dimensions. The knot you're seeing is actually about 30 feet that way. He pointed left, and 7 hours up. Karim blinked. Hours up? Time is spatial here, at the quantum level. Think of it like water pressure in your tunnel system. A temporal knot is just a blockage in the time stream's flow. Anubis handed him the quantum-ankh-wrench. Now, let's see how you handle your first repair. They made their way through the stuttering reality toward the temple. Construction workers, actual ancient Egyptian construction workers, moved around them in strange, repeating patterns. Some would carry a stone block halfway up a ramp, only to glitch back to the bottom and start again. Others were caught in temporal loops, having the same conversation about the day's beer ration over and over. "Don't worry about them noticing us," Anubis said. "We're operating on what you might call a maintenance frequency. To them, we're about as noticeable as a drafty breeze. Unless," he gave Karim a serious look, "unless you try to interact with them. First rule of temporal maintenance: look but don't touch." One misplaced handshake could unravel centuries. As they got closer to the temporal knot, Karim's keys began to vibrate more intensely. The oldest brass key pulled away from the ring entirely, floating up to what looked like empty air. But when Karim squinted, he could see it as sort of temporal rust, a corruption in the fabric of reality itself. Anubis sighed. "Just as I suspected. Time tourists." He gestured to a barely visible distortion in the air, about 7 feet off the ground. As Karim focused, he could make out footprints in the sand that appeared from nowhere, walked a few steps, then vanished. "Someone's been crossing their own timeline," Anubis explained. "Probably tried to get a better view of the construction. Ended up meeting themselves coming back from watching the sunset ceremony. Created a nice little paradox." He shook his head. "This is why we can't have nice temporal dimensions." Karim studied the knot with his newfound chronological senses. It was like looking at a mess of tangled wires behind a control panel, complicated, but fundamentally logical. "The quantum-ankh-wrench won't be enough," he said, surprising himself with his certainty. "We need to redistribute the temporal pressure first." "Very good." Anubis clapped his hands. "And how would you suggest we do that?" Karim reached for his key ring, selecting a small copper key that felt cool to the touch. "We create a temporary bypass, like rerouting water flow around a blocked pipe." He held up the key. "This one opens maintenance hatches, right? So theoretically, it should be able to—" He reached up and inserted the key into what looked like thin air. There was a sound like distant thunder, and suddenly a small door appeared, a simple metal hatch floating 7 feet off the ground. Excellent improvisation. Anubis was practically bouncing with excitement. "You're taking to this much faster than the last recruit." Poor fellow kept trying to file temporal maintenance reports in triplicate. We had to let him go after he attempted to establish a bureaucratic subdivision of the space-time continuum. Opening the temporal maintenance hatch released the pressure gradually. Reality slowly settling back into its proper flow. The construction workers stopped glitching. The temple walls ceased their architectural dance through time. But as the last temporal hiccup subsided, a new problem emerged. A man in elaborate royal regalia was striding toward them, and unlike the other ancient Egyptians, he was looking directly at them. "Oh dear," Anubis muttered. "Temporal Maintenance Code 2285. Always respect local authorities, even when they're technically 3,000 years dead." "Great Anubis," the pharaoh called out. "I demand an explanation for these disturbances in my construction project." He stopped before them, adjusting his crown. "The workers keep experiencing what they call yesterday's sickness, living the same moments repeatedly. And my chief architect swears he saw himself leaving the site before he had arrived." "Your Radiance," Anubis bowed, elbowing Karim to do the same. "Merely a minor temporal maintenance issue. All fixed now. Nothing to concern your eternal magnificence with." The pharaoh's eyes narrowed. "You said the same thing last moon, when that temporal tourist tried to graffiti her Instagram handle on my future tomb." He turned to Karim. "And who is this? A new maintenance deity?" "Temporal maintenance technician in training," Karim said, surprising himself with his steadiness. "First day on the job, Your Majesty." "Ah!" The pharaoh's face brightened. "Finally! I've been saying for ages that the afterlife needs better infrastructure management." Do you know how many souls get lost between dimensions because of poor signage? He pulled a rolled papyrus from his robes. I've compiled a list of suggested improvements for the temporal transit system. The hieroglyphs in the Book of Dead are terribly outdated. We really should update them to include proper emergency protocols. Anubis groaned softly. Your radiance, while your input is invaluable as always, perhaps we should schedule a proper meeting through the official channels? Maybe in a few centuries, when the paperwork has been properly mummified. But the pharaoh was already unrolling his scroll of complaints. First item. The quantum gateways need better accessibility features. Not everyone can afford a proper burial with all the navigation upgrades, you know? And don't get me started on the temporal Wi-Fi coverage. Karim's mental maintenance alarms began blaring. While the pharaoh spoke, he noticed something alarming. The temporal pressure was building again, but this time around them. Their prolonged interaction with a historical figure was creating its own paradox. Acting on instinct, Karim reached for his keys again. A small silver one caught his eye at what looked like a musical note etched into its surface. Without fully understanding why, he held it up and whistled a short sequence of notes. Reality rippled. The pharaoh paused mid-complaint, his eyes glazing slightly. Your radiance, Karim said smoothly. I believe your chief architect needs your input on an important matter. Something about the angle of the sun god's shrine? Oh. Yes, of course. The pharaoh rolled up his scroll, already forgetting about them. We'll continue this discussion later. Do something about those temporal tourist warning signs. And with that, he strode away, seamlessly integrating back into his proper time stream. Anubis stared at Karim. How did you know about the memory redirection key? That's not typically covered until at least the second week of training. Karim shrugged. It felt right, like how you know which wrench to use just by looking at a bolt. He paused, though I have to admit His Majesty had some good points about the signage. Indeed. Anubis checked his quantum readings. Well, that's this temporal not sorted. Though we should probably install some paradox prevention barriers before more tourists try to take selfies with Ramesses. He grinned, ready to learn about quantum concrete. Before Karim could answer, all his keys suddenly began spinning in agitation. A new alarm was sounding not from ancient Egypt, but from somewhere or someone else. Anubis said grimly, that would be the temporal emergency I was hoping wouldn't happen today. He pointed to a reading on his papyrus display. Someone's trying to use the Cairo Metro system to create a controlled temporal loop. They've figured out enough of the Book of Dead to be dangerous, but not enough to realize they're about to turn half of downtown into a time pretzel. Karim felt his keys pulling him toward what he somehow knew was the nearest quantum gateway. We need to get back to the present. The present, yes, Anubis agreed. But first, we need to make a quick stop in 1924. If someone's tampering with the temporal infrastructure, we'll need something from my personal toolbox. He paused. How do you feel about dealing with British archaeologists who've accidentally unleashed chronological chaos? Karim gripped his quantum-ankh-wrench tighter. It looked like he wasn't going to make it home for dinner after all. But then again, with time maintenance, being late was all relative. 1924 materialized around them in a haze of sepia tones and colonial ambition. They stood in the Valley of the Kings, where a group of British archaeologists huddled around what appeared to be an ordinary tomb entrance. But Karim's newfound temporal senses told him otherwise. This was no ordinary doorway. Howard Carter, Anubis muttered, pointing to a man in khaki clothing furiously scribbling in a notebook. Brilliant archaeologist, terrible at reading warning signs, especially ones written in quantum hieroglyphics. Is he the one who Karim began? No. Carter's actually quite careful. It's his assistant we're worried about. Anubis gestured to a younger man trying to hide something under his jacket. Albert Williamson. In about 3 minutes, he's going to attempt to smuggle out what he thinks is a sacred amulet. It's actually a temporal calibration device, what you might call a quantum tuning fork. Karim watched as Williamson nervously glanced around before slipping away from the main group. His keys hummed in recognition, pointing toward the object hidden beneath the man's jacket. We can't let that device reach Cairo, Anubis explained. In the present, someone's trying to use the Metro system's quantum resonance to create a temporal loop. If they get their hands on a calibration device from the original system, they could synchronize the frequencies. Karim finished, the knowledge flowing through him from his maintenance keys. Turn the whole metro network into one giant time machine. Precisely. And while that might sound exciting, it would be rather catastrophic. Imagine rush hour traffic, but with centuries instead of cars. They followed Williamson at a discreet distance. The young archaeologist made his way through the valley, occasionally checking to ensure he wasn't being followed. He couldn't see them. Of course, they were still operating on their maintenance frequency, but something seemed to make him nervous. He can feel the temporal resonance, Anubis observed. Some humans are sensitive to it. It's probably what drew him to archaeology in the first place, unconsciously seeking the remnants of our quantum network. Karim reached for his keyring, but Anubis stopped him. Careful. We're in a delicate position here. This moment is historically significant. Williamson's theft and subsequent disappearance become a minor archaeological mystery. We need to maintain causality while retrieving the device. So we can't just take it from him? Oh, we'll take it, but we need to do it in a way that preserves the historical record. Anubis smiled. How are you at staging mysterious accidents? Before Karim could answer, his quantum-ankh-wrench began to vibrate violently. Something was wrong not here in 1924, but in the present. The temporal disturbance they detected was growing stronger. We don't have time for subtlety, Karim said, feeling the urgency through his tools. The present is starting to destabilize. Anubis checked his papyrus readings and cursed in ancient Egyptian. The fools. They're already trying to activate the network. He looked at Karim. Right. New plan. How do you feel about breaking several thousand years of temporal maintenance protocols? Karim grinned, already pulling out his silver key, the one that had helped with the pharaoh. I thought you'd never ask. What happened next would be debated by archaeologists for decades. Witnesses would report seeing strange lights, hearing impossible sounds, and feeling an overwhelming sense of temporal vertigo. Howard Carter would later write in his journal about the day the valley itself seemed to sing. And Albert Williamson? He was found wandering in the desert 3 days later, rambling about time itself coming alive and stealing his discovery. The temporal calibration device, meanwhile, found its way into a certain maintenance worker's toolbox, safely tucked between reality seconds. The present was a mess. They materialized in Sadat Station to find time itself unraveling. Commuters moved in temporal stutters, some catching in loops, others phasing between moments like badly tuned television channels. The air crackled with quantum static. Well, Anubis said, watching a train arrive at the platform before it had departed, this is less than ideal. Karim's keys were going haywire, spinning and vibrating as they tried to process the temporal chaos. He could see the problem. Now someone had activated multiple quantum gateways simultaneously, trying to force synchronization without proper calibration. The entire metro system was becoming one giant temporal feedback loop. There, he pointed to the emergency exit sign near the platform's end. In his enhanced vision, he could see it for what it really was, an ancient quantum gateway, its hieroglyphics hidden beneath millennia of paint and renovations. That's the primary node they're using. They made their way through the chaos, passing commuters frozen in temporal amber and others experiencing their morning commute in reverse. Near the gateway, they found what they were looking for, or rather, Professor Hassan stood before the emergency exit, surrounded by hastily assembled equipment. Electronic devices were connected to what looked like pieces of ancient artifacts, creating a hybrid of modern technology and quantum archaeology. He was so focused on his instruments that he didn't notice them appear. Fascinating, isn't it? Anubis said loudly, causing the professor to jump. How humanity keeps rediscovering what it never quite forgot. Hassan spun around, his eyes widening at the sight of them. Karim? What are you? And who? His gaze settled on Anubis, and understanding dawned. Oh no. Oh no is right, Anubis agreed. Though I appreciate your initiative. It's not every day someone reverse engineers quantum temporal mechanics from subway architecture. You don't understand, Hassan said, frantically checking his readings. It's working. Look around, the temporal barriers are breaking down. We can access any point in history, learn everything, fix mistakes. Professor, Karim interrupted, his maintenance instinct screaming. the barriers aren't breaking down. Reality is, you're causing a temporal pressure buildup across the entire system. As if to emphasize his point, a nearby vending machine briefly transformed into its 1980s predecessor before flickering back. A group of schoolchildren walked past, their uniforms cycling through 7 decades of styles. The Book of the Dead, Hassan insisted, it's a manual, a guide to accessing the quantum network. I've spent years decoding it, understanding the mathematics hidden in the hieroglyphs. Yes, Anubis sighed, but you're reading it wrong. It's not a user manual, it's a maintenance guide. Those aren't spells for accessing the afterlife. They're repair protocols for temporal engineering. He gestured to the chaos around them. This is like trying to power a city by overloading all its electrical substations simultaneously. Karim felt something shift in the quantum field. The temporal pressure was reaching critical levels. His keys suddenly aligned themselves, pointing at the professor's equipment like compass needles. "We're out of time," he said, the irony not lost on him. "Professor, shut it down. Please." Hassan shook his head, clutching his instruments. "I can't. Not when we're so close. Think of what we could learn, what we could fix." "Time isn't meant to be fixed," Anubis interrupted sharply. "It's meant to be maintained. There's a difference." He turned to Karim. "I hope you've been paying attention in training, because this is your final exam." Karim stepped forward, his keys hovering around him like a constellation of possibility. He could see the quantum structures now, the intricate weave of time and space that ran through the metro system. Hassan's equipment wasn't just accessing it, it was tearing it apart. With movements that felt as ancient as they did natural, Karim began to work. His quantum-ankh-wrench interfaced with the temporal calibration device they'd retrieved from 1924. His keys arranged themselves in a pattern he somehow recognized from the Book of Dead, not a spell, but a repair sequence. "What are you doing?" Hassan demanded, reaching for his equipment. "My job," Karim replied simply. "Maintenance." The keys began to spin, faster and faster, creating a temporal field that enveloped the professor's jury-rigged setup. Karim whistled the same sequence he'd used on the Pharaoh, but this time infused with the resonance of the calibration device. Reality shuddered. One by one, Hassan's connections to the quantum gateway began to dissolve. Not broken, but carefully disconnected, like power lines being safely deactivated. The temporal pressure began to ease. "No!" Hassan lunged for his equipment, but froze mid-movement. Around them, time gradually began to stabilize. Commuters resumed their normal temporal flow. The vending machine settled into its present form. "Good work," Anubis nodded approvingly. "A bit unorthodox, but effective. Though we should probably do something about the professor's memories of all this." Karim looked at Hassan, still frozen between moments. "Actually, I have a better idea." 20 minutes later, Professor Hassan found himself in a temporal maintenance orientation session, his unauthorized experiments replaced with an official introduction to the quantum infrastructure he'd tried so hard to access. After all, Karim reasoned, someone that dedicated to understanding the system might as well learn to help maintain it properly. "You're going to make an excellent supervisor one day," Anubis remarked as they watched Hassan take notes on proper quantum gateway protocols. "Though we should probably get you home first. I believe your wife's Malokia is about ready." Karim checked his watch somehow. Despite everything, only 10 minutes had passed in normal time. "Just another day in maintenance," he said, pocketing his keys. Their gentle hum had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, a constant reminder that some doors weren't meant to be opened, but rather kept in good working order. The metro system rumbled around them, its quantum gateways now safely regulated, its temporal pressure properly maintained. Somewhere in ancient Egypt, a pharaoh was still complaining about temporal tourist signs, and in 1924, an archaeologist was writing about the day the valley sang. And in the present, a maintenance worker headed home for dinner, carrying the keys to time itself on his belt loop.